When the biker's fist broke the table and spilled coffee over the old man's book, the coffee shop fell silent. He roared, "Get out of my seat, cripple," and loomed over the one-armed veteran, who made no move. No one shifted. Not the air, not the customers, not the waitress. However, a young man with steely eyes and a baseball cap peered up from the corner. He was just another latte-drinking nobody to the bikers. The man in jeans was a tomb guard, trained to defend the living and pay respect to the dead. This was something they were unaware of, and no one in that little town restaurant could have predicted. And those 5 bikers would discover exactly what kind of man they had just crossed in the next 60 seconds. Before we continue, please subscribe and tell us, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments section. Join us in preserving their memory if you still think that virtues like bravery, honor, and sacrifice are important. The Brew, a welcoming coffee shop, a few miles from Arlington National Cemetery, had broad windows that were bathed in a golden glow as the sun hung low over the little Virginia town. At 8 a.m. on a Sunday, the place was alive with the soft murmur of weekenders. Warm pastries, freshly ground coffee beans, and a faint aroma of cinnamon filled the air. The clink of ceramic mugs and the quiet murmur of conversation filled the room, while the espresso machine behind the counter hissed and gurgled. Images of the town's history, ranging from Main Street in the 1950s to local boys in uniform leaving for battles in the past, were displayed on the walls in black and white. A young Marine in Vietnam, his face set with serene determination, was depicted in one faded photograph close to the register. The regulars knew who it was, but most people didn't look twice. A battered paperback on World War II was open in front of Ray Thompson, who the locals called Pops, as he sat in his normal spot by the window. Ray was a regular at the Brew at the age of 68, arriving on Sunday mornings without fail. He had a little Marine Corps pin on his blazer, his flannel shirt tucked in, and his silver hair brushed beautifully, a silent reminder of the arm he had lost to a grenade in Vietnam in 1970, was his left sleeve, which was pinned up just below the elbow. Ray's stance was attentive, as if he was still prepared for anything, yet his blue and piercing eyes searched the pages of his book. He never lost his old behaviors from his time as a Marine. Daniel Rivera, Lieutenant Dan Rivera to his unit, was seated at a corner table across the room, blending in with the others. Dan, who was 32 at the time, was one of the elite guards who guarded the unidentified soldier's tomb at Arlington. He exchanged his sharp dress blues for a black t-shirt, jeans, and a low-fitting baseball cap for his day off. Even though he had his laptop open and his business emails partially read, his thoughts kept returning to the coffee shop's well-known beat. A few months ago, Dan had met Ray at a veterans event, where the elder man's Vietnam memories had made an impression on him. When Dan entered, they gave each other a nod, a silent recognition between service-minded individuals. The Brew's 50-year-old proprietor, Lena Harper, walked between tables with her apron smeared from years of labor and her brown hair pulled back in an untidy bun. She stopped by Ray's table with a fresh pot of coffee after giving a friendly smile to 2 college students who were studying in the corner. She said, "Morning, Pops," with a gentle Virginia drawl in her voice. Ray looked up, a tiny smile forming on his face as he said, "Refill." She poured the black coffee, being careful not to spill it on his book, and said, "You know I can't say no to that, Lena. Keep it coming. Reading about the war again. You ever take a break from that stuff?" Ray replied in a steady, low voice, "History keeps you honest." Lena laughed and shook her head, saying, "Keeps you from forgetting what matters." She went on to the next table, where an elderly couple was sharing a plate of blueberry muffins and talking softly about gardening and grandchildren. "You're a stubborn one, Pops." Dan glanced at Ray as he sipped his latte. He was impressed by the elderly man's silent strength and his demeanor in spite of his lost arm. Ray reminded Dan of the men and women who had sacrificed all and asked for nothing, the troops he remembered every day at Arlington. Just as he was ready to return to his emails, the sound of motorbike motors rocked the windows, roaring through the still morning like thunder. 5 men strode in, their big boots hitting the hardwood floor as the door flung open. The leader, Jake Malone, also known as Razor to his, was a 6'4" tall man with a shaved head and tattoos snaking up his arms. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, and a sneer curled his lip. The other 4, Tommy, Spike, Mitch, and Carl, followed close behind, their eyes scanning the room like predators. They were part of the Iron Reapers, a biker gang that had been causing trouble around town for weeks. Conversations in the coffee shop trailed off, forks paused mid-bite, and the college kids in the corner shrank in their seats. Jake's gaze landed on Ray's table by the window, the best spot in the house with a clear view of the street. He smirked and walked over, his boots loud against the floor. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice carrying across the shop. "You're in my seat. Move it." Ray's blue eyes were calm but unwavering as he looked up from his book. He slowly put the paper down again and folded the page's corner. "I've been sitting here every Sunday for 10 years, son," he said, his voice steady with a slight Ohio accent. "Plenty of tables." The other motorcyclists looked at each other and moved closer. "You deaf, or just stupid? Pick another." Jake's smirk vanished, his face turning scarlet. "This is my table now," Jake stated loudly, attracting everyone's attention. The shop fell silent. The older couple stared at their muffins. The college kids froze, and Lena tightened her grip on the coffee pot. Ray remained motionless, taking a slow sip of his coffee with one steady hand and glaring at Jake. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, "but I'm not moving either." With a hard barking sound, Jake laughed. "I earned my spot here a long time ago." "Earned it? What? Are you a hero of the war?" "You're just an old man taking up space," he said, leaning closer and casting his shadow over Ray. With a shaky but forceful voice, Lena went forward and said, "Jake, that's enough. Move or I'll move you myself. Don't bother him, he's a good man. Stay out of this, Lena." Jake snapped, turning to glare at her. "Unless you want trouble too." Lena froze, her face pale. The other customers looked away, afraid to draw Jake's attention. Ray set his coffee down, his eyes never leaving Jake. He reached up and touched the Marine Corps pin on his jacket almost absently. "I've faced worse than you, son," he said quietly. "And I'm still here." Jake's face twisted with anger. He reached out, snatched the pin from Ray's jacket and tossed it to the floor. The small metal emblem skidded across the hardwood, coming to rest near the counter. Then Jake grabbed Ray's coffee mug and dumped it onto the table, the dark liquid spilling over Ray's book and dripping onto the floor. The sound of the mug hitting the table was like a gunshot in the quiet shop. Lena gasped, stepping forward. "Jake, stop it. You can't just shut up," Lena said. Jake roared, pointing a finger at her. "Stay behind your counter, or you're next." Ray stared at the spilled coffee, then at the pin on the floor. His cheek twitched, but he didn't move. He'd been through too much in his life. Jungle's gunfire, the blast that took his arm to let a punk like Jake shake him. He thought of Vietnam, the friends he'd lost, the promises he'd made to keep going. He wasn't about to let some loudmouth biker take that from him. Across the room, Dan closed his laptop with a soft click. He'd been watching, listening, his body tense, but his face calm. He knew Ray, not well, but enough to respect him. He'd heard the old man's stories at that veterans event. Stories of courage, of carrying wounded men to safety, of surviving when the odds were against him. Dan's jaw tightened as he saw the pin on the floor, the spilled coffee, the way Jake loomed over Ray like a bully picking on the weakest kid in the yard. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward Ray's table, his steps measured but purposeful. "Hey," Jake said, noticing Dan for the first time. "What's this? Do you have an issue, friend?" "Yeah, I do," Dan answered, his voice quiet but forceful with a faint Texas drawl, stopping a few steps away, his hands slack at his sides, his eyes fixed on Jake. "You're messing with a man who doesn't deserve it." Jake looked at his team and laughed, saying, "Hear that, boys? Pick up his pin, apologize and go." He moved closer to Dan, looming over him, and said, "This man believes he's a hero. Who the hell are you anyway? Someone who wants to be tough, just someone who knows right from wrong," Dan said without blinking. "Jake, pick up the pin." Tommy, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward and cracked his knuckles, saying, "You're out of your league, man." The other bikers chuckled, but there was a tense edge to their laughter. Dan continued, "I'm not the one who's going to get hurt, but I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing." His gaze shifted to Tommy, and then back to Jake. "Back off before you get hurt. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jake's grin vanished. He swung a meaty fist at Dan's face, fast and heavy, expecting to end the conversation right there. But Dan was faster. He sidestepped, grabbing Jake's wrist and twisting it in a smooth practice motion. Jake grunted in pain. His arm locked behind him, and Dan shoved him forward, sending him crashing into a table. Cups and plates shattered, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet shop. Tommy and Spike lunged at Dan from either side, their fists raised. Dan moved like he'd been trained for this, because he had. As a tomb guard, he'd spent years honing his body and mind, and his close-quarters combat training kicked in like muscle memory. He ducked under Tommy's wild swing, driving an elbow into the man's ribs, then spun and caught Spike's arm, twisting it until Spike dropped to his knees with a yelp. In one fluid motion, Dan kicked a chair into Mitch's path as he charged, sending the biker stumbling into Carl. The two crashed into the counter, knocking over a stack of coffee mugs. The fight was over in less than a minute. Jake was sprawled across the broken table, groaning. Tommy clutched his side, gasping for air. Spike was on his knees, his arms still twisted in Dan's grip. Mitch and Carl scrambled to their feet, but one look at Dan's steady gaze stopped them cold. The shop was silent, except for the sound of shattered ceramic settling on the floor and the heavy breathing of the bikers. Dan released Spike's arm and stepped back, his stance relaxed but ready. "Pick up the pin," he said again, his voice low and even, "and apologize to Ray." Now Jake struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. He glanced at his crew, but they looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, limping over to the counter where the marine pin lay. He picked it up, his hands shaking, and set it on Ray's table. "Sorry," he mumbled, barely audible. "Didn't mean no harm." Dan shook his head, louder and meaner. Jake swallowed hard, his pride in tatters. "I'm sorry." "Okay," he said, his voice clearer now. "I shouldn't have done that." He pulled a crumpled wad of bills from his pocket and tossed them on the table, for the coffee and the mess. Rye looked at the pin, then at Jake. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "Respect ain't something you take, son," he said quietly. "It's something you earn. You might want to work on that." Jake nodded, his bravado gone. He motioned to his crew, and they shuffled toward the door, their boots scuffing the floor. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air as they sped away, leaving the shop in stunned silence. Then the applause started. The older couple stood clapping loudly, the man calling out, "C'est parfait, Ray." The college kids joined in, their faces lit with awe. Lena rushed over, her hands clasped together, tears in her eyes. "Oh my God, Ray. Are you all right, Dan?" Ray grinned and patted her hand as she added, "We're fine, Lena. I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a good spot for you to run." With his heart still racing from the altercation, Dan slid into the chair across from Ray and said, "You okay, Pops?" "Been through worse," he continued, "but I appreciate you stepping in, Dan." Ray nodded, picked up his pin, and used his napkin to wipe it before repinning it on his jacket, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. Dan smiled, a rare diversion from his solemn manner, and said, "I guess I've had some practice." He paused, then continued, "I'm a tomb guard over at Arlington. Didn't know you had that kind of fight in you." Ray's eyes softened and then broadened. "A tomb guard, huh? I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't let them treat you like that." His voice trailed off as he said, "That reminds me of the boys I served with in Nam." Young, resilient, and heartfelt. Lena, still shaken, brought over a fresh pot of coffee. "On the house," she said firmly. "For both of you. You did them proud today." Dan felt a warmth in his chest, the kind that came not from praise but from knowing he'd done right. "I just did what you'd have done, Pops," he said, "what any of us would do for a brother. And don't even consider paying for those cups that broke. That's on Jake." The couple's older man came up, holding out his hand, and added, "I'm a vet myself," in an emotional voice. "Korea, 52. You two showed that punk what a real man looks like." He shook Ray's hand, then Dan's, his grip firm. "Thank you." Word of the incident spread fast. By the next week, the Brew was busier than ever, with locals stopping by to hear the story firsthand. Lena framed a photo of Ray and Dan taken that morning by one of the college kids and hung it on the wall, calling it the Honor Corner. The shop became a gathering place for veterans who started showing up on Sundays to swap stories over coffee. Ray and Dan became regulars together, their table by the window, a quiet symbol of what they'd stood for. Ray replaced his coffee-stained book with a new one, but he kept the marine pin polished and gleaming. Dan, for his part, found himself looking forward to those Sunday mornings, not just for the coffee, but for the stories Ray told, stories of jungles and sacrifice, of men who'd stood their ground no matter the odds. And every time Dan walked into the Brew, he felt a little taller, knowing he'd honored not just the unknown soldier, but the man sitting across from him, a hero in his own right. As the weeks turned into months, the Brew became more than a coffee shop. It was a place where the town came together, where veterans young and old found a home, where courage and respect weren't just words but a way of life. And for Dan, it was a reminder that duty didn't end when the uniform came off. It lived in moments like these, in standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear another story that's just as powerful and captivating, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about duty and justice. Click on the next video for more amazing stories.